We start off with the World Bank. It has cut its growth outlook for the global economy to 1.7% for this year. And that, of course, is down from its earlier projection of 3%. Now, the move by the international lender hints at a looming global recession. The World Bank says that the growth projection is attributed to what it warns as worsening economic conditions. Now, according to its latest economic report, the downgrade estimate marks the third weakest pace of growth in nearly 3 decades, and that's overshadowed only by the global recessions. Now, the World Bank is saying that tighter monetary policies around the world may have been necessary to tackle the rising inflation numbers, but they did contribute significantly to the worsening of global financial conditions.
There are multiple reasons why we have the slowdown. Of course, we have been going through one of the sharpest interest rate cycle. Interest rates have been increasing around the world. You have significant volatility in food markets, in commodity markets. And then, of course, we have a major outbreak in China. China slowed quite considerably. So a confluence of factors driving the slowdown in the global economy. Because of the possibility of inflation remaining elevated, that could trigger financial stress in some emerging market developing economies, and that could also trigger a global recession. We have a major war in Europe still there. Geopolitical tensions could escalate. Food and energy insecurity could be a problem. Social tensions, another major risk. And of course, COVID outbreaks, we cannot basically rule out. Beyond these, we should always keep in mind risk associated with climate change, the higher likelihood of natural disasters, as well as weaker growth outcomes, much weaker than what we are expecting. And there is this broader risk of fragmentation of global trade, investment, financial networks.
Well, let's now take that report apart further with Reginald Kadzutu, CEO at Amana Capital and economic analyst. He joins us now on the show. Great to have you with us, Mr. Kadzutu, and certainly Happy New Year to you. Let's start off with the fact that this report does paint quite a grim picture of this year. To quote the World Bank, it says their worst case scenario is now their baseline scenario. It also says that developing economies will be hit particularly hard going forward. So what's your take on these conclusions? And I'm curious to know, do you expect others, such as the IMF, to paint a similar grim picture?
Happy New Year to you, Uche. Yes, definitely. I agree with the sentiments of the World Bank on this. The outlook for 2023 doesn't look good, primarily because of the policy responses that happened during COVID time, and then external factors like now the war in Europe and the disruption that it brought to supply chains, especially for energy and for food. So if you look at what happened during the pandemic, where governments systematically poured money into the economy in terms of social support, literally gave people money, increased money supply, but without an equivalent money demand increase. So normally when national income increases, you'll find there's a demand for money, which then pulls up money supply. Here we had money supply increasing with no congruent increase in national income. So what that did, it increased aggregate demand in the economy without an increase in production. That was just a recipe for inflation without economic growth that would come with it and naturally bring it back down. To compound on that, because of that inflation, disposable income reduces. And when disposable income reduces, that means consumption also reduces. When global consumption reduces, all these economies start suffering and reducing. And as the global consumption reduces, emerging markets and developing markets that depend on the developed markets also start suffering, because then demand coming from there starts reducing. For example, if the British cannot import enough tea because they don't have enough demand, then countries that export tea start suffering. When China, for example, went through the lockdowns it went through, the global demand reduced for base metals. So countries like your Zambia with their copper and countries that normally export metals also suffer because then the commodity prices come down. And those situations do not seem like they're going to change in 2023 rapidly. And I think that's why the World Bank is saying that we might actually look at a recession, especially if inflation is not put under control. And I don't think piling up interest rates the way the developing world is doing is going to help, because when interest rates increase, investment in the economies reduce. Investment in the economies reduce, that means aggregate income also reduces, which now goes back into that vicious cycle of aggregate demand falling down.
Well, let's just talk about interest rates going forward, because it's interesting that tighter monetary policy was necessary due to high inflation. But at the same time, the bank says that that contributed to a significant worsening of global financial conditions. So what is your take on the outlook for monetary policy going forward, and how significant will that be to the global economic outlook?
It's going to be significant because if interest rates continue going up, one, that means cost of funding goes up. Most of these countries are in debt already. That means cost of replenishing or repaying their debt also increases. So you'll find economies who have been running on debt or bond sales and all of a sudden budget deficits start increasing. So we might be going into a period of vicious increasing budget deficits in the developing world. And as that continues, that means interest rates will continue going up and the developing countries suffer, because capital starts flowing back to the West or flowing back to the developing countries out of the emerging markets, which reduces investment in the emerging markets, reduces FDI in the emerging markets, also reduces portfolio flows into the emerging markets, which means that now emerging markets that were getting funding in dollars to fund their own deficits are now stuck with one, debt they have to repay, debt they can't refinance because then they cannot go and borrow, no one wants to bring in money. Stock markets, which are mostly driven by foreigners, will become sluggish, or if not come down in 2023. So monetary policy will play a key role, one in containing global inflation, but also determining whether we're going to see income in the developing countries increase. I think these countries now have to choose between using monetary policy or using fiscal policy, depending on what they think is the greatest risk that faces their economy. Because if they then use the wrong policy tool on a wrong target, then we are in for a longer recession than just in 2023.
Well, I definitely want to get your take on what role that China's economy will play in the overall global outlook, because it certainly seems to have a central place. So give us a sense of how significant China's economic outlook will be to the global economic outlook.
So China is the second largest economy in the world. And if your second largest economy in the world is not growing, that has a major impact on global demand. And China has been driving the demand, especially for commodities, your metals, your copper, your iron, and all. And if that demand for that goes down, you'll find Latin America will suffer. Africa will suffer. Those African economies and Latin American economies will suffer. The US might also suffer because one of the largest investors in US government bonds is the Chinese. So that means the US have been financing their growth and financing their infrastructure development, borrowing from China. And if China is not growing and they scale down on their US bond purchases, then the US now needs to find another source of financing their fiscal activities. So China is that central in terms of it affects aggregate demand and the financial markets globally, especially if they are not growing. It is good that at least the projection is that they are going to grow at around 4.5 to 5% in 2023, up from 2.2. From the opening of the lockdowns of the pandemic, there's going to be pent-up demand that is going to be there with lagged effects. So they might actually sustain that 1% GDP projection for the globe. But if China misses the GDP projection of 4.5 to 5%, then surely I think we will enter a recession even before June.